Go ahead and start recording here. So as far as this week goes, we've got a lot of stuff going on with the muscles. Okay, so lots and lots of muscle memorization, muscle studying. Okay, so we're for class, as you can see there on the overview page, we're talking about muscle today, talking about force generation, muscle tone, motor units, and then Wednesday's class asynchronously will be on the neuromuscular junction. And then Friday's class will be another TBL day, which is purely on muscles. Again, just like the last one was on the hip and the thigh muscles, this one will be on the shoulder and the scapular muscles, okay, pectoral girdle muscles, okay. You have a lab quiz on Thursday, which is over the human lower body muscles, okay. So some of those you've already learned in the TBL day a couple weeks ago. Okay, so that's good. You got a little bit of a head start there. But yeah, so you're going to want to go to the lab handout and I sent out the announcement this morning that shows exactly which pages to go to in the lab handout, which sections in that table towards the end, and you're gonna learn the human lower extremity muscles. And there's two videos that where I'm going through the cadavers on that. There's one on the anterior side, and then there's one on the posterior side for the lower extremity muscles. So make sure you watch those cadaver videos, and then also make sure that you go to the textbook as well. So you can definitely study and master an A&P for that, and practice anatomy lab that has images directly from cadavers. You'll want to study those, but then also go to the textbook and find the figures that have those same muscles, because some of the cadaver images are just really hard to tell certain muscles, like the iliopsoas and ones like that are kind of way up in the abdomen. So and some of those trickier ones will tend to use diagrams like you see in the book, like more drawn diagrams. So definitely study all of the muscles that you need to know in the cadaver picture format and like a drawn diagram format. Okay, so that'll be for the lab quiz on Thursday. We won't meet synchronous, we will meet synchronously this Thursday. So the way that that'll work is you'll take your lab quiz right at your selected lab time, and then right at about 15 minutes after that, you can hop on the Zoom and we'll start the synchronous lab class that way. Okay, so you'll take the quiz first on your own with HonorLock, without Zoom, and then when you're done with that, you'll hop onto the Zoom and we'll do a brief synchronous lab session. Okay, it won't be super long, just be kind of a little bit of an overview of some of the muscles coming up. Okay, so that's for the lab. So we've got that, and then you've got the human lower extremity muscles for the lab that you're studying. You've got the shoulder muscles for Friday's TBL class. Okay, and then the lab or the lecture quiz this week is also on muscles. Okay, and so this next exam is heavy on the muscles. Okay, so you pretty much just get to you'll pretty much just get to study mostly muscles this whole section for the exam. Okay, so that quiz on Saturday, on Friday, quiz 6, the one you see there at the bottom, I'll just go ahead and click on it. Lecture quiz 6. It's not going to tell me what it is because it's locked, but it's completely over the section in your notes called muscles not covered elsewhere. Okay, so it's at the end of exam 4, or at the end of section 4 in your note packet. If you flip to the end there, you'll see a kind of a PowerPoint, and it's the last one in the outline for section 4. It says muscles not covered elsewhere. Okay, so it's the wrist muscles, the forearm muscles, the abdominal muscles, and some other ones. Okay, so that's purely what quiz 6 on Friday is over. Okay, just to give you an idea of that, there's no time limit on that quiz. Okay, so if you want to, I would still recommend trying to study some beforehand, but if you want to just make that your study time while you're taking the quiz, that would be one way to handle it too. Okay, so you're studying human lower body muscles this week. You're studying human shoulder muscles this week, shoulder and scapular muscles, and then you're studying that other packet of human muscles, which is mostly forearm and also it's lower leg muscles, which you've already learned in the CAT, forearm muscles, and abdominal muscles. That's what that muscles not covered elsewhere packet includes. Okay, so there's some crossover there. You've already learned the cap muscles for the lower leg, and so a lot of those are similar in the human. And so there's definitely crossover between lecture and lab during this section that helps some, but there's still there's a lot of information coming at you with all these muscles. So one thing I highly recommend with the muscles is to try to find them on your own body. Okay, touch them, feel them, move your body, and doing the movements that you're supposed to, the muscles are supposed to do for you. See if you can feel those muscles tighten up. It's just another layer of interaction with the material, and another way for you to just kind of stick in your memory. Okay, so making it much more tangible, because it is tangible, right? It's real muscles on your body. And so if you can find a way to actually feel those, move your body, see where they are, it'll just be much easier to remember them if you have that touch point with them. Okay. So a couple questions people had. Would it be possible to make the be able to see what you got wrong in the lab quizzes? That's something you can definitely do with me in a one-on-one type of situation. If you want to set up an office hours appointment, I'm happy to do that with you, just like I do for the exams. And then someone's asking about Professor Mahoney's section. She's doing the exact same as me as far as synchronous lab time meeting right after the quiz. So yeah, same setup there. Okay. Questions that anybody has on what's going on this week, or anything else you'd like to ask before we get rolling on today's class?
Could you say again which muscles? You said the shoulder and scapula, the forearm, the lower leg, and something else.
Shoulder and the scapula is for the TBL day on Friday. So that's the packet that you'll see there. But then you'll see at the very end of the note packet for section 4, you'll see a PowerPoint slideshow titled "Muscles Not Covered Elsewhere," and that's the one you'll need to study for the quiz that's due Friday night at midnight. But again, that quiz has no time limit. So if you prefer just to make the time you're taking the quiz, the time that you study for that, that would be one way to do it. Okay, because I know there's already a lot of studying you're doing for the other 2 sections of muscle. So yeah, for sure. Okay, what else, guys? Other questions I can answer? Okay, if you haven't got into that to the Muscle Lab resources page yet, make sure you do. The videos are helpful there, and so definitely spend some time there if you haven't done that yet. Okay. All right. Oh yeah, and you should have gotten some emails that came from me that contained people from your team's feedback to you on your TBL performance. Okay, so that came from me, and it just had like your name, and then it had like a little table with how each person, or how the one person rated you on each of the things you had to get a rating on, and then some subjective feedback in open-ended questions there. Okay, so you should have gotten one of those from each member in your team. You don't know who it was from, each one, but each member on your team most likely filled one of those out for you. And then if you filled all of them out for the members on your team, you should have seen 3 extra credit points get added to your score on Canvas. Okay. All right, guys. Anything else I can answer before we get going?
Dr. Sawyer.
Yeah.
That's the third link for Friday's TBL thing. It's not like, you know how yours is like showing off of the screen thing? It's not showing up for me. For
which link, Eddie?
So like the one you have for Friday for the TBL.
Oh yeah, I know, it's like sticking over to the right, huh? That's weird.
Yeah, that's also like that the writing on the white is not showing up for me at all.
Okay, that's weird. I'm not sure what happened there. It doesn't normally do that. I think I know what the problem is. I'll fix it right when I send you guys to a break room. I think it's because the way I made it wrap text to go that way instead of go down. I'll fix that. Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, guys. Let's dive into what we're talking about today, which is some muscle physiology and a little bit about how skeletal muscle works. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is how muscles generate force and kind of different types of contractions, different locations of muscle and how they can generate force. So a few related questions here. Okay, so this first one is kind of an application question that I'd like you guys to talk about in your teams here. Okay, and so if you look at those three positions there, okay, so you look at A, C, and B. Okay, so A is what I would call fully extended. Okay, so if you're doing a bicep curl and your arm is fully extended like this. B would be fully flexed like this, so you're just starting right here. And then C would be about right in the middle. Okay, and what I'd like you to do is normally if I had you right next to a partner, you could do this on your partner, but since you're not, what you can do is do it on yourself. You can actually resist a bicep curl like this when you're fully extended, resist yourself when you're right in the middle, and then resist yourself when you're fully flexed. And I want you to kind of do this and talk about it a little bit with the people in your team, and then decide which one you think can produce the most force. So key thing here is that you're not letting yourself move. Okay, you're doing what's called an isometric contraction, which is just how much force can you produce at the position that the woman is in A, the position she's in B, and the position she's in C. Okay, which one do you think you could produce the most force in if you were just not allowed to move, or you're just pushing as hard as you can against somebody either at A, B, or C? Okay, so I'm going to open that up on the app as well as send you to your breakout rooms. And so try that on yourselves, or maybe you got somebody sitting next to you, you can try that on, and then talk about it a little bit as a team, and I'll bring you back shortly in about a minute and a half. Okay, go ahead.
And Professor Soar, since my phone isn't working.
Oh yeah, for sure. Let me find which one you're in.
No, I can join it. Just my iClicker Reef. I can't. My phone literally is black. Like it won't turn on right now.
Oh shoot. Okay. Okay.
Either.
You should be fine. I mean, you can miss about 5 or 6 at least and still get the full credit for that. So.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, Cameron. Yeah. All right, guys, send in your answer if you haven't yet. Okay, looks like everybody's back. All right, gonna go ahead and shut this off. Send in your answer if you haven't yet on that question. Okay, so we got a bit of a spread there on what you guys think would produce the most force, A, B, or C. Usually what I do if I had you in class, which is kind of fun, is have a little force measurement device that I use, and I bring somebody up who thinks they've got a big strong bicep, and I make them do curls against me and actually measure how many kilograms of force they can produce at each of the 3 positions. But I won't do that because I don't have anybody. Brett should be the one to do that, Ryland says. Yep. If I have Brett right here, I would love to test out your biceps, Brett. Sorry, I'm not able to do that. But yeah, all right. So it looks like still the winning answer there out of the 3 was C, which is the correct answer for sure, the one right in the middle. Okay, so C is definitely the correct answer. Oops, my pencil. There we go. Yeah. So let me tell you why though, physiologically. Okay, it's something called the length tension relationship of muscle. Okay, and it gets back to what we talked about with sarcomeres last week, and we've talked a little about the sarcomere in a couple different places, but it's kind of functional unit of muscle, right? We got the actin and the myosin, those myosin heads sticking up, connecting to actin, and that's actually what pulls, those myosin heads pull on the actin, and that's what provides the force in the muscle, right? And so we want to think about those 3 different positions here, okay? And so if we think about sarcomere A, this would be one that's already fully shortened, and this one's using the wrist muscles, like so doing this like wrist flexion instead of the elbow flexion, but it's using the wrist muscles. Okay, so if we're already shortened like this and then we try to produce some more force into flexion, this is what our sarcomeres look like. They're already pretty shortened, right? And once they get a certain amount shortened, they just can't go anymore. There's no more room for them to go. And so when you think about all the different sarcomeres acting when we're doing this wrist flexion, there's millions of them, right? Millions and millions of them. And so when you're already fully shortened, or when you're already flexed like this, many of those sarcomeres are already fully shortened, which really means they can't help us produce force, right? It's only the few that aren't fully shortened that can help us out in producing force. Okay, so we don't get a lot of force there. And so this on the y-axis here is tension, or how much force is being produced, and then this down here in the x-axis is kind of stretch or sarcomere length, right? Sarcomere length. Okay, so when we're already shortened like this, the force or the tension production is very low, right? And then the other extreme, when we're out here, sarcomere C, if we're all the way extended like this, these muscles are already stretched out, what happens is, and this is the myosin and this is the actin, right? So it's myosin, that's actin, okay? So what happens is if we think of myosin and actin like this, if we're already stretched out like this, then we've got a bunch of myosin heads like all along here that they're not touching actin, right? They're just sticking out up into the air, or not really the air, but up into the cytoplasm of those muscle cells, right? And they're not attaching to actin, so they can't do anything, right? They're not helping us produce force if they're not touching actin, right? And that's exactly the situation when your muscle is already stretched out, okay? And so then when we get right here in the middle, we have what's called optimal overlap, okay? So we get optimal overlap of actin and myosin, and we have room to shorten. All right, so there's still some room to move. There's still more shortening capabilities, but we have enough overlap to where a lot of myosin heads are interacting with actin, so we can get a lot of force for those, but then we still have a lot of room to move, right? And that's why that position in the middle is the most the position that can produce the most force. Okay, and we naturally know this, right? So for example, if I was going to come back and I was going to do a squat jump as high as I could, if I come down and just try to jump up as high as I can, right? I most likely wouldn't do it by just bending my knees a little bit and then just try to jump up, right? We know that wouldn't work. I also wouldn't do it by putting my butt all the way on the ground and trying to jump up, right? I would get somewhere about right in the middle and then I would jump up, right? And so we kind of naturally know that this is how our bodies work, but this is just a little bit of the kind of structural reasons why that we can produce the most force when our muscles kind of right in the middle like that. Okay. All right. Questions on that so far? Okay, so that's the length tension relationship. And this kind of spells it out for us a little bit more. So when we're fully shortened, which would have been, let me go back here. So the fully shortened one would have been B here, okay, the fully flexed. Okay, so that would be B. What happens is there's too much overlap, interference with actin and myosin, really just no more room to shorten. Right? If we're fully lengthened, which would have been the other one, when the woman's arm is all the way down like this, her elbow is fully extended, what happens there is not all the myosin heads are actually in contact with actin, right? We got some myosin heads that are just not doing anything. They're just missing the actin. But then when we're right in the middle, as I've said, we've got the optimal overlap of actin and myosin. And then we also still have some room to shorten. And so this is how we get the maximal force generation. Okay, so remember that term, the length tension relationship of muscle. It's going to apply later to the heart too. Next semester, when we talk about the heart, it's a very important factor in the force production and how much pumping ability the heart has as well. Okay, give you guys a sec to finish writing that down. Questions for me? And Eddie, I think I made an adjustment on that course overview page. Does it look any better when you get a chance to take a look at it? I know it might not still be an active link, but it might all be in the right spot at least.
Yeah, it's all showing now.
Okay. Yeah. For some reason, when I have to put two links in, I can't get them to always be an active link that you can click on. But hopefully you can still just copy and paste it or something.
Oh, I think you haven't put that in yet. The video of in-class activities.
Yeah, that'll be when we actually do the class on Friday. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Cool. All right, guys. All right, so let's look at a couple other things that are related to how much force a muscle can produce. Okay, so number one that we just talked about was the length tension relationships. That would be like the starting position of the muscle. Okay, another one here that we just need to think about when we think about how a muscle is contracting is the amount of load we have on the muscle and how that relates to how quickly a muscle can contract. Okay, so if we use our same example of a biceps curl and we don't put any load at all on our biceps and we just contract as hard as we can, so that's the top one, no added load or very light load, we can contract very rapidly, right? We can contract super fast, okay? Then we have another situation where I'm gonna resist myself just as hard as the amount of force that I'm producing in my biceps. So if the load matches the force production, we're not going to have any movement, right? That completely will stop the movement, right? If the load that we're trying to lift matches our force production, then that just balances out and there's no movement, okay? But then we have the third situation where the load is actually heavier than the muscle can carry or just heavier than the amount of force the muscle is producing at that time. And then what happens then we have a lengthening contraction, right? So that would be, I'm trying to do a bicep curl, but I'm actually pushing down harder than my bicep is producing force. And so I'm still contracting my bicep as it's lengthening, but it is lengthening instead of shortening, okay? So those are kind of three different situations. And we'll talk about those three different situations and what we call them as far as contraction types here in a second, okay? But before we do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about what muscle fatigue is about, okay? And fatigue is a very complicated concept. It's not something that we have a full grasp on how it works and why people fatigue at different times. And there's different types of fatigue too, right? There's types of fatigue like you're doing a bunch of bicep curls and your biceps start hurting a lot, right? That's very different than I'm running up the hill from Young Hall up to Flex, right? That's a different type of fatigue, right? One is much more cardiovascular, right? Or then there's the other type of fatigue that I'm just gonna run at a really slow pace for a couple of hours, right? And I get really tired, right? So there's many different types of fatigue, but the two kind of broad categories of fatigue are called central and peripheral fatigue, okay? So central fatigue is this idea that your brain is actually stopping you from contracting muscle, okay? So it's like consciously you're thinking, I want to push myself, I want to go faster, I want to keep going, but subconsciously your brain is actually not letting you contract any more muscle, or it's not letting you, it's actually decreasing the amount of muscle force you're producing by decreasing the amount of contraction that you're doing. Okay, so that would be central fatigue, where your brain is actually stopping you. But then there's the peripheral fatigue idea, which means that there's something going on in the muscle itself that's making it so you can't contract it. Okay, so for example, it could be that you're producing a bunch of lactic acid, right? We'll talk more about that when we talk about metabolism, but you guys have probably all heard of it. When you're doing a bunch of intense exercise, you release lactic acid. Lactic acid it releases hydrogen ions, and then those hydrogen ions can bind to things, like it can get in the way of the action potential that is supposed to form on your muscle. That nerve signal is supposed to form in your muscle. It can get in the way of that. It can mess with that, right? It could also get in there and bind to actin and myosin and maybe troponin and kind of change the shape of some of those proteins and make them so they don't work as well, right? It could do the same thing to our enzymes that run our metabolism, that help us produce ATP. Okay, so in that case, your brain is trying to contract muscle, right? Your brain's sending the signal, but when the signal gets there, it's just not quite getting the amount of muscle contraction that it should, because you've got some problems down there in the muscle itself, or in the communication between the nerve and the muscle, right? So that's peripheral fatigue. Okay, as far as central fatigue goes, there's been some great studies that have looked at this. One of my favorites to mention is this one where they had a bunch of professional cyclists, kind of like this guy, and they have this cool device that puts a hologram right over here. Okay, so it puts a hologram cyclist right next to the other guy on the bike, and it has a screen like that. And they brought these professional cyclists in and measured all of their physiology while they did a time trial. Right, so they have them on their bike without the hologram guy first, and they just have them go as hard as they can, as fast as they can for a certain distance. Okay, and then they record that, kind of know exactly what their maximum ability is, and then they bring them in 2 more times. And those 2 times they're racing this hologram guy. Okay, so they project this hologram image, and both times they tell the cyclist that the hologram person is set at your exact pace you did last time that you did this trial by yourself. All right, one of those times they're telling the truth, the other time they're lying. Okay, but the cyclist doesn't know that. The cyclist thinks that both times they're at the exact pace that they were the first time. But one of the times they're actually going 5% faster than they did, and the other time they're going the exact pace that they think they should be going. Okay, and in every single case, even though the cyclist thought he was at his max both times, in every single case at the time where the hologram guy was going 5% faster, the cyclist was able to keep up. And what they did, they actually measured the physiology, looked at how they were producing that extra force, and really they were just pushing themselves into a little bit more stressful state. They're pushing themselves into higher level of what's called anaerobic metabolism that we'll get to, but pretty much just pushing themselves further into acidosis in their body, and all the things that normally make us feel uncomfortable and make us want to stop. Since the brain thought, well, I know I can do this, I'm going to do it. It allowed the person to do that, right? And so that's kind of a good example of a central fatigue. Whereas if you trick your brain to believe that you can do it, then your brain will let you push yourself a little bit further than you think you actually can consciously, right? So that's just one example. There's many other examples of central fatigue, which is kind of a cool one there. So yeah, so you just kind of need to know in general what central versus peripheral fatigue actually means. So any questions on that? Any curiosities or thoughts? Okay, go ahead. Lindsay, do you have one?
Kind of. Just like with how
I lost you there, Lindsay. You froze up on us.
muscles, but you feel fatigued. And like it feels like your body is set to maintain a reserve energy supply and not push itself to the maximum. So is that your body trying to preserve energy even though like you're not actually exerting yourself?
I missed a little bit of it. I just didn't hear the first part. What was the situation again?
Oh, I said, is fatigue caused by like certain mental illnesses, by depression, like central fatigue or peripheral fatigue.
Gotcha. Yeah, that would definitely be connected more to the central fatigue side of things, and just kind of your total level of drive that comes from your kind of your conscious thought, and even also the idea with central fatigue is that your brain is sensing all kinds of stressors out on the periphery, like it's sensing the level of oxygen in your blood, it's sensing the level of CO2 in your blood, it's sensing the level of hydrogen ions in your blood, and it's getting that feedback, and then the brain decides, all right, that's about as much as I can take right now. I'm not going to let you go any further, right? And so if your brain's already dealing with this massive amount of stress or this massive amount of things that are just kind of putting your brain as max, then most likely those stressors that are sensed on the periphery, your brain's not going to let as much of that happen because it's just kind of already overwhelmed with these other things. And there's definitely some evidence to show that too, that kind of just mental status plays a big role in central fatigue as well, for sure. So definitely your overall level of stress and your overall level of mental health plays into this for sure. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Dr. Sawyer, I got a question as well.
Go ahead.
How much does CNS fatigue affect your available force output? So I know that kind of can change day to day. Like one day you might be able to go in the gym and squat 300 pounds, but then the next day you're a little bit more tired, or you're tired from yesterday, or your CNS isn't used to it and you can't do it, even though your muscles can squat it. But it's really a CNS thing. How much does that really come into play, and why does that vary so much?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Brett. And I think it's just totally related to what we're talking about with this idea of central fatigue, which, like you said, would be CNS fatigue or central nervous system fatigue. And I think the bottom line is we don't know the answer to that. Even this idea of central fatigue is still versus peripheral fatigue is debated all the time by physiologists in this area, and just trying to understand, like, obviously the brain has a big role to play, but it's much harder to predict exactly, and it's much harder to measure kind of how big of a role and how likely it is for the brain to kind of intercede and stop you from exercising, or so it's still a pretty unknown area of research. And that's why I said in the beginning, fatigue in general is a pretty unknown area. It's easier to do the peripheral fatigue because we can do studies that measure the amount of hydrogen and do this, and then that can be kind of linked to these things. But when it comes to the brain, it's so complicated and there's so many factors, right? And yeah, so it's super challenging to get at the answer to your question. But I think the bottom line is, yes, for sure. If you think it's just your muscle is the only thing involved in squatting, then you're way off, right? It's not just your muscle, right? Your muscle you got to have the right amount of muscle to lift a certain amount of weight. But we never use the full capacity of our muscle. If we did, we could literally rip our muscles off of our bones, and our muscles could break our own bones if our body let us use the full capacity of our muscle. So we never actually use the full capacity of our muscles. So then it's just a matter of, well, how much is our brain going to let us put the stress on our muscle, right? And so then you get into this whole field of like, wow, what are all the factors that are just helping your brain decide how much it's going to let us contract that muscle, right?
Absolutely. Do they know if there's any sort of way to train your CNS to essentially have greater muscle recruitment? So that's like another way of increasing strength without increasing muscle mass or strength itself.
No, absolutely. It happens all the time, right? Yeah. So when we do strength training, all of the strength gains that we see within the first 4 to 6 weeks of a strength training program, almost all of them are nervous system related. Yeah. And so we don't really see changes in muscle structure until about that 6-week time point. But actually the research shows us that half of the total strength increase that we get in like a 6 to 12 month training program, half of it is due to neurological adaptations. And so the structural part of our muscles actually getting bigger, that's important for sure, but that doesn't really kick in till a couple months in. But we get a lot stronger in those first 4 to 6 weeks, and that's all due to neurological adaptations, and a lot of that is due to more muscle recruitment, but also just more muscle synchronization and timing of using the correct motor units at the right time. So it's incredibly important, those neurological adaptations. Yeah, good
I have
question.
a quick question as well.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Does central fatigue or peripheral fatigue tend to hit first?
Yeah, another good question. Yeah, it's probably not like that. It's probably more like they're all kind of working together. It's probably because the same things that the brain is sensing to get its feedback about what's going on the periphery, and then to decide, well, I'm not going to let you contract. Those same things like hydrogen ions and maybe lower levels of oxygen or higher levels of CO2, those same things that are causing the central fatigue are also causing the peripheral fatigue. So it's probably all kind of happening at once. But yeah, it's again very tough to track, and probably different depending on the person and the type of exercise you're doing and the situation. So I would say it's probably both going on at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you guys got some great questions. Sure. All right. Well, let's keep moving on. Let's talk a little bit more about fatigue here. So some causes of fatigue, and these would be so some possible causes, right? Depletion of ATP. This could happen if you use up all the ATP in a muscle cell. It can't contract anymore, right? Your body really doesn't let you do this very often. Okay, so it's very rare. One thing that is closely linked to fatigue during endurance activity is depletion of glycogen. Okay, so glycogen is that stored form of carbohydrate, right? We store it inside of our muscle. We burn it mostly, we break it down mostly when we're doing intense exercise, okay? And the more we start depleting that stuff, the more terrible we feel. It's closely linked to our feelings of fatigue and our feelings of perceived exertion. And so that's why people carb load before a marathon and things like that, because they're trying to get more glycogen inside of their muscle, okay? Metabolite buildup, that's kind of what I've been talking about this whole time. We build up levels of hydrogen, potassium, calcium, okay? And this can lead to problems right there at the muscle, and that would be the peripheral side of things. But then it can also be sensed by chemoreceptors out there in the muscle, and then that would be sent back to the brain. The brain can interpret that and decide whether or not to let you keep contracting muscle, right? And that would be the central fatigue side of things. And then temperature is huge, right? Muscle temperature is huge. Also could be related to peripheral fatigue or central fatigue with that muscle temperature. So those are just a few things that we know are strongly linked to fatigue. Okay. All right. Any other questions about fatigue before we keep going? Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about muscle tone. I've already talked about it some, but again, it's this constant low level of contraction of muscle, and this is not something that we consciously have to think about. This is due to spinal reflexes, meaning that the brain doesn't really have to be involved. It's using the spinal cord to contract muscles to the right degree. Okay, and this does things like helps us keep our posture. Right, it helps us keep our muscles kind of a little bit contracted and ready to contract hard if we need to, right? But how do we not fatigue, right? If our muscle cells are just always contracting and holding us up, holding our neck up, holding our back up, right? Sometimes we do fatigue when we're sitting for too long or standing for too long, but in general, what we're doing is we're rotating the muscle cells that are active. Okay, so for example, a small muscle like our biceps brachii, the one we've been using for an example, has about 250,000 muscle cells in it, right? So just that one little muscle's got that many muscle cells. So the brain is constantly giving feedback about how those muscle cells are doing. And when it senses certain ones are fatiguing, it says, all right, you get a break. I'll let you guys relax for a little bit, and I'll kick in another group of muscle or another set of muscles within that muscle, right? And that's what I mean by rotating active muscles to maintain force. Okay, so some purposes of muscle tone, as we've talked about joint stability, we wouldn't want our joints just to be totally loose, right? We want the muscles to kind of be contracting around them some, just to kind of help keep them stable, hold them together, and then obviously posture. And as I just said, keeping muscle ready to respond and contract at any time. We want it to be somewhat contracted and ready to go. Okay. So that's muscle tone. Now another one here, which is a separate situation from the length tension relationship, are the 3 different types of muscle contraction. Okay, and so I'd like you to think about this one by yourselves here for a sec, and which of the following movements would allow you to lift the most weight on a bench press. Okay, and so think about it this way: starting with the bar all the way in your chest. Okay, somebody helps you lower it down, and you just start with it on your chest, and you lift it up yourself. Okay, that would be A. B would be you start with it on the rack, and you just lift it, and all you have to do is lower it down. You don't have to do anything else with it. You just have to lower it down in a controlled way. Okay, or the third option would be somebody helps you lift it off the rack. They help you get it down, help you get it to right about at mid-range. Then all you got to do is hold it. You just hold it there. Don't let it move. Okay, those 3 things represent the 3 types of contractions. Yeah, take a sec. What we do, I think we have time. Why don't I send you into your breakout rooms here one more time here for this class, and decide what you guys think on this one. And I'll bring you back in just a little over a minute, and I'll open up the thing for you to vote on your clickers. Okay, go ahead. All right, guys, everybody should be back. Make sure you send that in on your clickers, your clicker app, I mean. Okay, so let's see what you guys think. A, which would be start with it on your chest and lift it up. B, which would be started on the rack and lower it down. Or C would be hold it right in the middle. So we're somewhere between B and C, almost about 40% of you each saying B or C, and then about 15% of you saying A. Okay, well, here's what I would say. I would say start with the bar on the rack and lower it all the way down to your chest. You're probably going to be able to do the most weight with that one, right? So just the lowering phase where you're holding it up and just lowering it down, I would say that's where you're going to be able to put the most weight on that bar, okay? And let me connect that to the 3 contraction types. Okay, so the first contraction type is called concentric. Okay, and this is the shortening type. Okay, if we're connecting it to these 3 over here, and you can go by the little arrows, right? So this one's going up, this one's going down, and this one's not moving. Okay, so B would be, so A would be the shortening one. Okay, eccentric contraction. This is controlled lengthening contraction, right? This is the one where you hold it and you're just bringing it down in a controlled fashion. That's called an eccentric contraction. It's a lengthening contraction. Eccentric contractions can produce 50% more force than a concentric contraction. Okay, and most of that extra force is provided by just stretching out our muscle to its maximum ability. And so when we stretch out our muscle, we use that titin protein, which is like shaped like a spring, and it tries to spring back, and that elastic component of muscle gives it a lot of extra tension on the muscle, and a lot of extra force. Okay, so that one would be B over here, just so you're connecting it. Okay, and then there's the third type, which is isometric, which just means contraction with no movement. Isometric means the same. Iso means the same, right? Metric is the movement part. So no movement at all. That's where we just take it and we just hold it right in the middle. Okay. The type that we definitely need and to get bigger, if we want to get our muscles bigger, and the type that leaves the most soreness is eccentric. If all we do is ride a bike, then we never do eccentric contractions, right? Because we're not weight bearing. Okay. So in order to do eccentric contractions, we got to be weight bearing. Okay. Even swimming doesn't really provide any eccentric contractions, right? We got to be weight bearing. This is a big problem in space. You don't have any eccentric contractions when you're in space. Typically, they have to create special exercise equipment that forces you to do eccentric contractions, so all your muscle doesn't waste away. Okay, eccentric contractions are very, very important for building muscle. Okay, so that's the lengthening type contraction. Okay, questions on that? So this will be the lowering phase of that bench press when we're coming down.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So like how I was understanding of the question was if we use the most force when we're like mid-range, like we were saying, and if we kept it there for like the 10 seconds, I was just like wondering why that wouldn't use as much force as like lowering all the way down. It was like, I thought it was like eccentric also, but just like understanding.
So that's a separate issue. So the first one, when we talked about the length tension relationship, that was 3 different positions of an isometric contraction, right? So those were 3 different isometric contractions. One, and if we did it to the bench press, it would be one right here, and then one right there, right? But all 3 of those examples with the length tension relationship we talked about at the beginning, there's no movement, okay? But in this example, we have 3 different types of contractions. One of them is isometric. That's the one holding it right in the middle. But then we also add in the one where the muscle is shortening, which would be us lifting the bench up, or where it's lengthening, where we're lowering it down. And so it just brings in a whole nother element when we bring in the option for muscle to contract eccentrically. It's going to produce way more force than it can when it's not moving at all in an isometric fashion. So yeah, it's an important question, Hannah. I'm glad you asked it, because you want to separate these 2 concepts in your mind. You want the length tension relationship. That's 3 different places, 3 different locations for isometric contractions to happen. And then there's this thing, which is we're talking about now, which is the types of contraction, and that's concentric, eccentric, isometric, and they're all different types as far as how much movement's occurring in the muscle. Okay, good question. Okay, so yeah, so let's kind of summarize this here a little bit. So which joint position produces the most force? We'll just say right in the middle. Okay, which one produces the least? We didn't really differentiate between the 2 extremes, but we'll just say either extreme. Okay, either fully lengthened or fully shortened. Okay, which muscle contraction is most likely to lead to muscle soreness? Eccentric, and it's because 50% more tension on muscle. And muscle soreness is really caused by little micro tears that occur in muscle. And so the more tension we put on muscle, the more of that soreness we're going to get. Okay, so change in length with concentric, that's a shortening contraction. Isometric, no change in length. Eccentric is lengthening. Okay, force produced with the 3 types of contractions. This one's the most, and then these are less. Again, we didn't really differentiate between concentric versus isometric, but they produce less force than eccentric contractions. Okay. Everybody got that? Okay. All right, so let's talk about the neurological side of things a little bit here and the way muscles are set up. So there's this concept called the motor unit, okay? And so the definition of a motor unit is all of the muscle fibers that are innervated by a single motor neuron. Okay, so a motor neuron's a nerve cell, a neuron, right? The one that controls our muscle. And so one of those nerve cells comes down, branches out, and connects to a bunch of muscle cells like it's shown here. So neuron 2 is the blue one. It's going to come down and connect to this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one, right? Number 1 is going to connect to just these 3, right? And so if we send a signal down the axon of motor neuron number 2 there, all the blue ones are going to contract, okay? And that's what this means, all contract or none contract, okay? And that's in a motor unit. So we can't just send a signal down motor neuron number 2 there and just have 2 of the blue ones contract and then the other blue ones not. That's not how it works. All the blue ones contract at once, and that's just one of the properties of a motor unit. Okay, so that's the motor unit. A little bit more about motor units. Each muscle consists of lots of different motor units. Okay, in each motor unit, you can either have a small number of muscle cells. That would be a muscle that's important for fine control, like the muscles in your face, muscles that help move your eyes, muscles in your hands that are helping you do small little movements when you're writing, things like that. They don't produce a lot of force, but they produce very fine movements, okay? If they have a lot of muscle cells in them, then these are the ones we use to produce a lot of force at once. Okay, so coarse movement, high force, but low sensitivity, low specificity. Okay, so some examples of each. So some large ones would be like our soleus muscle, pretty big, 180 fibers per motor unit. But then way bigger than that even is our gastrocnemius. These are both muscles in our calf, right? We're talking 1,000 to 2,000 muscle cells in each motor unit in our gastrocnemius. Okay, small ones, like I said, fingers, eyes, they have as little as 3 muscle cells per motor unit. Okay, most muscles have a mix of some small ones, some big ones, but most muscles will tend to be better for one or the other, fine control or large force production. Okay, so let's talk a little bit here about kind of what it looks like to contract a muscle and what that nerve signal looks like. Okay, so what we have here on the y-axis is the tension that a muscle produces, and then each of these little arrows represents an action potential or a stimulus, okay, or a group of action potentials, okay? And those action potentials are the stimulus that go down the nerve cell, right, or the neuron, okay? So if we have multiple stimuli, but they're pretty well spread out, what happens is we get some force in muscle, we get some tension built up, right? But then we have a little bit of time till the next stimulus comes. So then that tension is allowed to drop a little bit as muscle relaxes. But then before it totally relaxes, right, it doesn't get all the way down to zero tension, another stimulus hits. So then we can build on that previous amount of tension, right? And then this keeps happening a bunch of times, and you can see the overall tension we get builds, and we get much higher, okay? This is known as unfused or incomplete tetanus, okay? That tetanus term is an important term, okay? So we get just a multiple stimuli, and the tension is building in muscle, so those multiple stimuli can kind of build on each other. Okay, but most of the time when we contract muscle, this is what it looks like. We get a bunch of stimuli all right next to each other. That builds tension to the point at which there's no relaxation in between at all. And we just get a nice smooth amount of force production. And that's known as fused or complete tetanus. Okay. And you guys are going to be doing some stuff in lab related to this in the muscle physiology lab. Okay, that's typically how muscle contractions work, is we get a bunch of them, a bunch of stimuli all close to each other. We get the amount of force we need, and then that force just stays there. We get a nice smooth muscle contraction. That's more the normal type of contraction. Okay. All right, any questions on those? Yeah, Natalie, the example is just what I said. For the most part, all of our muscle contractions are going to be are the tetanus type of contraction, where we get a lot of force in a nice smooth type of contraction. Okay, you'll see when you do the lab that for example, we might have like a little muscle twitch, right? Like we just kind of contract the muscle for a second, we get a little bit of force, and then it relaxes. That would be more kind of like this situation here with the unfused tetanus. But for the most part, when we're doing all just kind of normal contractions that we do in everyday life, most of them are going to be this tetanus type of contraction. Lindsay, go ahead.
What about when like people twitch in their sleep? So would that be like the same thing?
Yeah, that'd be more like the first one, which would be like an unfused type tetanus. Yeah, we get a little bit of force, and then it just relaxes. Yeah. So what I'm going to do, since we're about out of time, there's just a few more slides here, but I will just go ahead and pause the video right now, and then I'm going to keep recording right after you guys sign off from Zoom, and then I'll post this video like I normally do. But I would like you to go to this last part of the video and watch this last part here, because this is some important stuff about how we vary the amount of force we produce in a muscle. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just pause. All right, so let's talk about this one here. So control of tension produced. The amount of force generated by a muscle is dependent on these three things, and these are the key factors that we're going to talk about here. So the number of motor units contracted, how many motor units are we contracting? Okay, the size of the muscle cells within those motor units that are contracting. That's number 2. And then number 3 is that length tension relationship that we started out with. Where are we in the length of the muscle? Because if we're really stretched out, we're not going to produce as much force as if we're somewhere right in the middle. Okay, so let's talk about those first. Okay, or let's talk about those 3 things. So stimulus strength is an important part that's going to dictate the number of motor units contracted. Okay, so the number of motor units contracted depends on the strength of the stimulus sent from the brain. Okay, so this image up here shows a small stimulus all the way up to a big stimulus. Okay, so we might have a very low stimulus like this first one. And this is referring to how many motor units are actually contracted within the muscle. You can see if the stimulus is too small, it's actually below the threshold and we don't get any contraction at all, right? None of those motor units contract. But then as we work our way up to a stimulus that actually hits the threshold like this one, then we can see a couple motor units are contracting, right? And then as we keep getting stronger and stronger stimulus, what you're seeing, we're adding more and more motor units to be contracted. And then once we get to maximal stimulus, you can see all the motor units are contracted, and it doesn't matter if we contract harder, okay? And the amount of tension we produce is down here, and we can see that maximal amount of tension was reached, and it just stays there, okay? So, but as we're building up and adding more motor units going from here to here, we're adding the amount of tension produced as well, okay? So the stimulus strength, so just we'll talk more about what that means, but it's really about how many action potentials are coming from the central nervous system. How many action potentials are coming is going to dictate the number of motor units contracted, right? And the more motor units we contract, the stronger the contraction is. Okay, the other thing to think about is not just how many motor units are contracting, but how big are the muscle cells in the motor units, right? So the smallest muscle fiber motor units are always recruited first, okay? So with that low level stimulus we talked about at the beginning, we're just gonna contract the motor units that have little muscle cells, the smaller muscle cells. But as we get a higher stimulus, we'll start contracting the ones that have kind of medium-sized muscle cells. And then as we get our full, strong stimulus, we'll start contracting the ones that have the largest muscle cells, okay? So it's really a combo of how many motor units are contracting, but then also how many, or how big are the muscle cells within those motor units that are contracting. And as we go up in stimulus strength, we increase both. We get more muscles, more motor units contracting and bigger muscle cells contracting.
Dr. Sawyer,
Yeah, go ahead.
what causes a stimulus to increase in size? Like
Yeah.
what stimulates the stimulus, I guess?
Great question. Yeah. So if it's a conscious type of thing, it would be like, let's say I'm using my my quadricep muscles to just lift my, extend my knee like this. When I'm just sitting here like this, I'm just extending my knee like this with no weight on it. Versus I'm going to go back and I'm going to try to kick a ball as hard as I can, right? So there's a conscious level of, I know about how much force I need to produce to do what I'm going to do. And so on the one I know I don't need to produce much force, that's going to provide or need a lower stimulus. But then when I go to kick that ball as hard as I can, then the brain knows that that's going to need more force. So it sends a stronger stimulus, which will activate more motor units, and it'll activate the bigger motor units too. So there's that kind of conscious level usually of how much force production the brain thinks is needed. And then it'll send a stronger stimulus to meet that demand. Okay.
So I have a question
Go
too.
ahead. Yeah.
Does that connect in with like our reflexes in how you can train them to get faster, or if you're not more active in that area, they're slower in that area?
It's connected to it a little bit differently because our reflexes are purely driven by the spinal cord, meaning that the brain doesn't have to be involved in reflexes, and that's kind of the definition of what, and that's why they're called spinal reflexes, is because the brain can control them. The brain can definitely control them and dampen them. If it feels like the threat that's being perceived is not really a threat, then the brain will shut down that reflex, right? And that's kind of what you probably mean by training our reflexes, is that it's training how much the brain is involved in that reflex, because it doesn't have to be involved. And if the brain isn't involved at all, then we get a big reflex. But then if the brain senses, all right, well, I know that's supposed to cause me to pull my arm back, but I know it's actually not really a threat. so the brain doesn't make you do it so drastically, you know, right? And so that's kind of the way that we can modify reflexes, is by some conscious thought. But yeah, so it's connected to this in a way, but a little bit different of an idea.
Oh, okay. I was just like, in reflexes and not like something that you would be reacting that would be harmful or something, but more of, I guess in like the sports terms, where if you were, a ball's coming toward you and you're kicking it and you're using the right muscle, or you're working with that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like the reflex I was thinking of, not like
yeah.
something's hot and then you like move your hand
Sure.
away.
Yeah, so that would be more like your neuromuscular control would be kind of what you're training there, which is kind of what we were talking about earlier with some of Brett's questions about how we get better at contracting muscle and better at controlling muscle. That's kind of more neuromuscular training that we do with any type of training will improve neuromuscular. The brain will get better at contracting the right amount of muscle at the right time to produce the right amount of force. And that is a separate issue from reflexes, but I know what you mean by kind of using that term reflexes to describe that. Yeah, cool. Okay, so then let's just walk through this question here. So how does the body control how hard a muscle contracts? Okay, so for example, the same muscles that I would use to reach across and grab Eve's face and give her a nice little caress. I could use those same muscles when I'm working out to punch a punching bag as hard as I can, right? It would be the exact same muscles doing that. So how does my brain change the amount of force that I produce to achieve what I'm trying to do, right? So which ones would vary? Well, definitely the number of muscle cells being stimulated, right? Because that's connected to the number of motor units being stimulated. And then we just talked about how that's directly connected to the size of the muscle cells, because the motor units with the small cells contract first, and then it works our way up to the larger ones, right? And then the strength of the electrical signal being sent from the nervous system, that's actually what dictates both of these, right? So definitely that's important. And then the number of motor neurons being stimulated. Remember, a motor unit is one motor neuron, so one neuron and all muscle cells innervated. Okay, so definitely the number of motor neurons being stimulated is important. So all four of these factors are playing into producing a varied amount of force by the same muscle. Okay, any questions on that, guys?
Could you please repeat what was written in red at
Sure.
the bottom?
Yeah, so that's really just repeating the definition of a motor unit.
Okay.
And so a motor unit is one motor neuron. I just put an arrow down here instead of writing neuron again, because it was right there. But yeah, so one motor neuron and all the muscle cells innervated by that motor neuron. That's a motor unit. So the D being the number of motor neurons being stimulated. If we already said that the number of motor units being stimulated is a factor, then definitely the number of motor neurons being stimulated would be a factor too. All right, guys. Anything else? All right. Well, thanks for hanging in here. You probably more thank yourself that you don't have to go back and watch the video to get the last 5 minutes of it. But